Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing Game 2 of the regular season, the second game against the Golden Knights, in which the Sharks have lost once again, this time by a score of 5-1, now having lost to the Golden Knights in each of the first two games by a combined score of 9-2. Now, I can say that this game was an improvement over the first game, although if it hadn't been an improvement over the first game, I would have been very upset because that first game was quite bad, but you could definitely see there were some sort of positive signs in this game, even though it was still a loss, and technically a loss by an even wider margin than that first game, but it started off pretty well for the Sharks. I'd say the first few minutes went somewhat smoothly until the Knights got their first goal, and as we know historically, when the Knights get a first goal against the Sharks, the rest of the game doesn't seem to go very well. So after Carrier's first goal, it was Marchessault who made it 2-0 at the end of the first, then McNabb and Nosek to make it 4-0 at the end of the second, and then they traded goals in the third period, Goodrow ruining Fleury's shutout, as well as Nosek getting a second one to make it 5-1 as a final score. So the first thing to talk about would be Martin Jones. Now, of course, we know Jones had a very solid game in that first game of the season, even though the Sharks lost 4-1. Tonight, it was okay, but you really have to look at that first goal from William Carrier. As I said, the Knights historically, when they get that first goal against the Sharks, they really get rolling, and it's upsetting that that first goal that led in by Jones was a pretty weak one. And so while the other three goals weren't particularly his fault, he ended up actually getting pulled. Going into the third period, Dell came in. I don't know if this is because the Sharks want to play Jones in tomorrow's game or if this is because they want to warm up Dell for tomorrow's game. But I was pretty surprised to see Jones not come out to start the third. Again, even though that first goal was quite weak and you could definitely put some blame onto Martin Jones in the end for this result, I thought he was okay after that, and he was sort of in the same position he was in that first game of the regular season. Next, to talk about the lineup, as I said, the lineup looked quite awkward. Yeah, last game I said DeBoer made some really strange decisions. I thought he improved it somewhat here. I liked the decision to put LeBanc with Hertl on the second line, so instead of having potentially your best forward playing with players like Radil and Bergman, you at least put him with a slightly more, a substantially more skilled player like Kevin LeBanc. And in the first period, I thought that second line at least got some offensive zone time, even if not too many chances really came from it, so I thought that was a smart play. Next, I would like to talk about the rookies a bit. All of these are sort of small points before I get to the main meat of the video, but I thought the rookies were improved coming in from the last game. I liked Yurtakin. He had a couple of good offensive moments. He also had a few very solid defensive moments, which was nice to see. I saw a lot from Bergman that really makes me believe he should be a solid mainstay on the fourth line for the San Jose Sharks going once the lineup really gets a bit more settled and Evander Kane comes back and all of that. And I thought Ferraro also looked a lot more settled in his spot defensively. He was a bit jumpy in that first game, but he seemed to be a bit more secure tonight. Next, and before the final point, I will talk about the power play, which was once again quite bad here tonight. It had some decent movement, but with the lack of Joe Pavelski, you could really see it because it really lacked a lot of finish, and so no actual goals were scored. Instead, the Sharks gave up 2 shorthanded goals, now having given up 3 on the year, so they are a grand total of a perfect -3 on the power play. Technically, you could even argue that the first goal by Nosek was shorthanded, even if it was a couple of seconds after the power play had expired. So it's really not looking too good on the power play. The Sharks are certainly not going to be able to duplicate their 6th place in the league last season on the power play, I'd guess. But hopefully they can still somehow sneak their way into the top half of the league. But seeing these first couple of games, you're starting to doubt that somewhat. I mean, just taking a look at the second power play unit, it's a bit awkward because all of a sudden, if you're running Burns and Carlson in the first unit, you've got Joe Thornton. They were running Gambrell, Sorensen, and Yurtakin on the second unit, which is not that great. But moving on to the main point, and that would be Burns and Carlson and what exactly they bring as a play style to the San Jose Sharks. Now let's take a look back at how the Sharks looked this past season, the 18-19 season. They were second in the league in terms of goals for, only behind the behemoth that was the Tampa Bay Lightning, and so it was basically like the Sharks could score at will. They had 430 goal scorers in Meier, Kane, Pavelski, and Hertl, and so even in games where they would let in 4 goals, they would could manage to score 5 more often than not and take the victory. This is what led to that insane stat of something along the lines of 37-1 when the Sharks would give up 2 or less goals, because they were averaging over 3 goals per game. And so they could somewhat afford to play a bit more of a run-and-gun style, a bit more of a risk-reward style. But this season, they are objectively less skilled than they were. So I think the prime example of what the Sharks tried to get away with, or what they were getting away with last season, and they tried to do again in this game, and how it didn't work out. The prime example would be that first period. The Sharks actually had moments where they had offensive zone time, but because of potentially a lack of chemistry, certainly, but also that lack of skill, they couldn't really translate that into any solid chances. And so further on in the period, when they would get burned by this type of play style, for instance, on the Marchessault goal where they have that bad giveaway between Karlsson and Burns, they do not have really any goal scoring support to fall back on. And so if they try to play the same way they did last season this year, where they don't have Pavelski's 38 goals, they don't have Nyquist's 60 points, and they don't even have Donskoi's 40 or so points, they're gonna get burned more often than not. But then what do? You can't necessarily go up to Burns and Karlsson, who you're paying close to $20 million between just the two players, and say, oh, how about actually stop trying to play too offensively and play a bit more defensively? Why would you be paying a player like Erik Karlsson $11.5 million if you're not even going to let him do exactly what he can do? We saw again in the first period, to reference, some plays that really only Erik Karlsson is capable of making, but we also saw some turnovers that were quite bad. So if you really get him to hunker down and play a bit more defensively, there's no reason to be paying a player $11.5 million to do just that. You can get a much more affordable option who could bring that same power. So it's almost like you do need to let Burns and Karlsson do what they can do, but then all of a sudden you're going to get burned on the back end. So what is the solution here for the San Jose Sharks? Honestly, I'm not 100% sure. You could take a look at teams like the Dallas Stars last season, a team that had some high-end offense in the likes of Ben Radulov and Seguin, but really lacked the offensive depth, and how they decided to play a bit more of a defensive style where they could get games in which, at the halfway mark, the teams haven't even combined for 20 shots between them, even though when you take a look at a Sharks game, a team could have 20 shots just in the first period alone. The Sharks could try and go that route, but again, do you get Burns and Karlsson on board with something like that? Do you want to even get Burns and Karlsson on board with something like that? The solution is definitely some murky waters ahead. Now, I don't want to take too much judgment from these first couple of games. The Golden Knights, in my opinion, are the best team in the Western Conference, at least at the moment. They're a team that was likely waiting 5 months since they were eliminated in Game 7 against the San Jose Sharks last season to get their revenge, and that they have done. So they were certainly circling these 2 games as the first 2 games on the calendar, looking to defeat the San Jose Sharks. I think we'll get a much nicer picture of how the Sharks are really going to look when they come up against a much more middle-of-the-pack team like the Ducks tomorrow. But I think one thing is for sure is that if the Sharks do try and just replicate what they did last season, they likely will not have nearly as much success as they did there. I don't suspect, let's say, a second place finish in the Pacific Division if they try and do that. I don't suspect a Western Conference final finish if they try to do that. So I think a shift in the play style is something that's going to be tough to do, but might just have to happen. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, as I said, tomorrow against the Anaheim Ducks. Game 3 of the season, the Sharks will be looking to get their first win on the board. As I said, a more middle-of-the-pack opponent, so something that is certainly more probable. But they are going up against John Gibson, and since they've had such issues scoring in these first couple of games, it certainly won't get easier moving forward. And Evander Kane, of course, will still be serving suspension there, so we'll see what happens. Class dismissed.